In this video, we're going to take a look at the Breyer defense in the Ruy Lopez, and it's an example of one of the closed variations which take place after the following standard 9 moves. We made a video analyzing these 9 moves previously, and I'll put a link to that video in the description below if you'd like to have a look. But a lot of closed variations begin from this starting point right here. And previously we looked at the move knight to a5, which is called the Chigorin defense. And the point of that is to gain a tempo on the bishop on b3 and to release the c-pawn to come forward and participate in the struggle for the center. But the Breyer defense is this strange-looking move, knight to b8, retreating the knight back to its original square. Now this defense is an example of a hyper-modern defense where black intends to control the center from the flanks and not necessarily attack it with pawns. So black doesn't necessarily have in mind to push this c-pawn to c5 to attack the center. He may do that later, but that's not the main intent of the opening. The main reason for playing the knight back to b8 is to redeploy it to d7, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. By the way, Breyer, who lived from 1893 to 1921, was a Hungarian national champion, and he's famous for saying, after 1e4, white's game is in its last throws. All right, from here, the game almost invariably proceeds with d4, establishing this nice classical pawn center, and then knight bd7. Now, by the way, after d4, the pawn on e5 was under attack twice. So it needs defense. It's only defended once. So black's intended follow-up does the job. It defends the e5 pawn. All right, white plays knight bd2 and proceeds to embark upon a normal maneuver with this knight that you see in a lot of Ruy Lopez variations, which is to move it to d2, to f1, to g3, and perhaps even to f5. It's a standard way of developing that knight. And now black proceeds bishop to b7 and has a nice long diagonal for the bishop and exerts pressure on the e4 point. Contrast this setup with the Chigorin. In the Chigorin, black has his knight on a5. And when the knight's on a5, it often wants to retreat either to b7 or to c6, and that would interfere with placing a bishop on this diagonal. So this particular setup looks pretty harmonious to me. All right, with the e4 pawn under pressure right now, white can't follow through and play knight to f1 because there would be insufficient protection for that pawn. So white makes a concession and plays bishop to c2 to guard e4 to release the knight. That bishop would rather be on this nice, more active diagonal pointed at f7 rather than defending the e4 pawn, but that bishop does have potential to participate in the game later on. So black proceeds with rook to e8, putting further pressure on the e4 pawn indirectly, and then knight to f1 as planned, and now bishop f8. So bishop f8 is an attack on the e4 pawn. Black is threatening e takes d4, and then he would have 1, 2, 3 attackers on e4, which is only defended twice by the bishop and rook. But that's okay. White intended to play knight to g3 anyway, and now the knight defends e4. Okay, play proceeds with g6. So black can fianchetto the bishop, but g6 also does a good job at restricting the g3 knight. All right, so most games that enter the Breyer after knight to b8 arrive at this particular position. And now we'll look at a couple of continuations from here. First, we'll look at the old main line. So this is the position after white's ninth move, h3, right before the Breyer move, knight to b8. So let's review. d4, establishing that strong center. Knight bd7, redeploying the knight, guarding e5. Knight bd2, heading for f1. Bishop to b7, pressuring e4. Bishop c2 drops back to protect it. Rook e8, putting further pressure on e4. Knight f1. Bishop f8 releases the rook. The threat is e takes d4, and then capturing on e4. So knight g3 to protect e4, and then g6. So here, one of white's plans is to attack this vulnerable b5 pawn. And you can do it a couple ways. You can do it by playing a4 or c4. The old main line begins a4. Now black doesn't want to take that a pawn and leave himself with an isolated weak a pawn here. So this pawn is going to need some kind of defense because white can attack it further with queen e2, bishop d3, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on it. The standard way to proceed is to play c5. Black doesn't want to play c6 to defend the pawn and block in his bishop. And with c5, the intent is to play c4 to block this diagonal, so the queen and bishop cannot get to that pawn on b5. Now white takes the opportunity to lock up the center and gain space with d5. As soon as that black pawn came off of c7, that's a good time to push to d5 because there's no longer a pawn that can move to c6 to fight against d5. Black follows through with c4, blocking the diagonal. And now white gets on with development. Bishop g5, an active square for that bishop. Black kicks it away, but the pawn on h6 is weak. Knight c5, the knight sinks into a natural outpost. Queen d2 attacks the h6 pawn, so that pawn moves forward, and then the bishop returns to g5 to its active post. Bishop to e7, giving up the idea of fianchettoing and breaking the pin on the knight. Rook a3, the intent here is to double rooks on the a file. Knight fd7, black would love to trade his bad bishop, which is on the same colored squares as his central pawns, with white's active bishop. And white doesn't have it, he retreats his bishop back to e3. Alright, we'll stop the old main line there and turn our attention to another variation. We'll call this the modern approach. So again, this is the position after white's ninth move, h3. And the Breyer move is knight b8, and then standard is d4, knight bd7, knight bd2, bishop b7, bishop c2, rook e8, knight f1, bishop f8, knight g3, g6. So the old main line here was to attack b5 with a4. A more modern approach is to play the move b3. And so white aims to attack b5 with his c pawn instead of his a pawn. He wants to play c4 and have it supported by b3. One reason to do that is to keep more pieces on the board. In some cases when you play a4, you intend to trade a takes b5, a takes b5, and these rooks that are facing each other on the a file can come off the board. Well, if you play your pawn to c4 and trade like this, then the rooks will still be separated by the a2 pawn. Okay, another point of the play here with b3 is to support c4, which thereby supports the move d5. So if c6 is played to play against d5, then there will be a c4 pawn to support that. So that's white's aim. Bishop g7 is a normal move here, main line, but there is another idea. Some players have played c6, trying to stop white from pushing to d5. A lot of people don't like to block in their bishop, though. So the main line is actually bishop g7, and then d5, rook c8, c4, as intended. Now c6 fighting against d5. Bishop e3 is a natural developing move. Bishop d2 is also possible. Knight b6. Okay, now there's an attack on the c4 pawn. It's under attack twice by the knight and the pawn. It's only defended once, so white defends it with queen e2. And then black will normally trade c takes d5, c takes d5. And white has a lot of extra space in this position because his central pawns are further advanced. We'll stop the variation here, but I will note that it is extremely common for black to play knight takes d5, sacrificing a piece in this very position. And then follows e takes d5 and knight takes d5 again. Okay, so something worth exploring. All right, thanks for watching the video.